Landmines and jellyfish. Welcome back to Knives, I guess. And it was like this. I had to flush twice. But do me a favor and hit that like button or you'll never get to be a virgin. And we just did a live stream and we went in on the Spyderco Sage 5 and Rex 121. So, let's take a look at what we're holding because it'll bother you if I don't. And you know I love you. So, first things first and most importantly, the pocket clip is tip up, which is the Lord's carry. We've got the FRN scales, that's what they are, not G10, my bad. We've got a spider hole. Let's flick the hole. And we've got 3 inches of Rex 121 steel. Okay, now that that's out of the way, Cardboard Slayer on this was a weird experience. You know, it was right about as weird as that time your aunt was giving you the bedroom eyes. That was a record live stream. We did 11 hours and 9 minutes, and I learned a lot from this. However, I started from a place of complete ignorance about the steel. All right, all I knew about this was it had a reputation for holding an edge forever and being hard to sharpen. You know, like 70 HRC is what Spyderco's advertising, plus or minus. And yeah, that's all I really knew about it. So with that non-existent knowledge base and the potential for me to speak from a place of ignorance, please take everything with a grain of salt. Whatever I got wrong, if you know a lot about this steel, please sound off in the comments. Let me know what I got wrong, okay? So, you know, let's do our explanation of how we're gauging this stuff. And because we are making so many cuts, you know, we counted like 900 cuts in 30 minutes, 4 to 7 inches, maybe 9 inches in that range over the course of 30 minutes. We can't count each individual cut. You know, we use the amount of time spent cutting. Normally gives us really reliable data. It's really consistent. Sounds like it might not be, but it's been really consistent. So, you know, that's what that is. Not the most scientific, precise testing. We're just getting a good idea of what the steels do compared to each other. All right. Now that that's out of the way, let's take a look at our timeline of events first before we really talk about, you know, all the here, why, what, where, and when, okay? So we started the live stream at noon. I gave myself a lot of extra time. I was planning on 12 or 13 hours. We got 11, which is a personal best for live stream length. But we started at noon, and on the tester, on the electronic tester, we started at 222 on the factory edge, which was a bit of a disappointing factory edge knowing what I knew before starting this. So we cut for an hour, and let's flick the hole again. You know, we went for an hour, all right, and we pulled a 412 around the belly and the tip in this area. We pulled a 403 back here, and at the heel, we pulled a 233. So it felt like it wore down really fast. However, we ran for another hour. And we got a 447 back here, we got a 476 towards the tip, and we got a 230 back at the heel where we tested. Your numbers are going to move around on the tester a little bit because it depends on exactly where you test and how much pressure you put on it. I tend to be really consistent with the pressure, but sometimes pop it a little faster than others, but mostly it's just you're testing an area as wide as the wire on that thing. It's going to change even if you measure the same edge in a couple different spots, you'll see a few points of difference. All right, and in this case, the tester wasn't too useful. We'll get into that, though. So we kept going, and at the 3-hour mark, it's like, I was scared this was going to crap out at like 3 or 4 hours. I thought it was going to be like D2. All right, the wear looked a lot like D2 when we started in on this thing. That's what I'll say, is at this point, I was thinking it was going to wear out like D2 did, and it's like, is this really going to go that long? So we went for another hour, and we pulled a 495 back here, a 377 back here between the belly and the heel. 491 back at the back part of the belly / tip area. And then we pulled a 437 up here towards the tip. All right. So I thought I might have a tiny burr, and that's what was happening. I don't think it was after what we learned. But I stropped it, and I will say, Lacey's diamond emulsion is some great stuff. We stropped it and went down to a 335 up towards here. In the worst area, and then a 194 back here at the heel. Like, it knocked down something like 100, and it knocked it from nearly 500 to 335. That's a huge gap. You know, that emulsion's great stuff. I will link off to that in the comments, but we'll get to that in a little while. So we went for another hour. At the 4-hour mark, we were back up to 456 back here or right up here in the belly / tip, and a little bit farther back, a 405 in the belly. All right, so we kept going. We kept going, and it was starting to feel like it was just going to stabilize right there and go forever. So we went for another hour, and we hit a 532 up here. Now, this is where the testing got a little bit derailed. The anonymous viewer that donated this knife, and with something this expensive, it's like 250 bucks. I thought it was 300, but that's the G10 version, not the FRN version. He asked me to stop and get it stropped up, so I responded to his request. I said, all right, I don't want to do this right now, but we'll go ahead and do it. So that's kind of skewing the results a little bit, but we stropped it back down to a 350. That Emulsion is amazing stuff. So we cut and we went for about another 50 minutes. And that's where it really got derailed. And again, the guy that donated this also did a $50 super chat. A $50 super chat and asked me to cut glass with the edge and then sharpen it. All right. So we grabbed an old candle, and where is it? We got this cut right here, and we got this really, really deep cut. And I sawed on it, and it felt so weird doing that. All right, because normally an edge would just slide across the glass and not accomplish much. But the way the carbides are in here, it felt like I was cutting it with a saw. It felt like I was cutting it with a saw, and like I wasn't being gentle with it, but it still cut way easier than I thought it would. Now, I have seen somebody else cut glass with it and then do the copy paper cut, and it looked great. Mine didn't do that, but I really, really reefed on it, and it was already showing a lot of wear. So we got a 1068. The most pressure we've ever seen on something. We got a 1068 right about here. And then towards the back, we got a 608. So it cut the glass, but I nuked the edge doing that. I absolutely nuked it. So he wanted me to sharpen it at that point, and we sharpened it. We gave her what for with the precision adjust, and we brought it down to the 220s. 220s kind of all the way across, and that's one thing that's kind of cool. This stuff sharpens up really evenly all the way across. Now, I was worried that in the process of sharpening it, it was going to be a very, very difficult thing to sharpen, again, based on reputation, but it took no time at all. It took no time at all. We wound up zapping this thing with the Precision Adjust Professional. It went easy as hell. It went easy. It went fast. I saw a very, very tiny burr. I couldn't quite feel it with my fingy, but I saw a very tiny burr on this thing. So, that was really cool. We went to 3000 grit. We did the full run of the strops from 9 micron down to 0.1 micron. We gave her what for and got her down to the 220s, about where it was from the factory. So, we started going again, and we got another hour in, and it went down to 371 and 346. The new edge I put on there held up a little bit better than the factory edge. Another 30 minutes, we got a 460 right up in here where we tested. All right. So at that point, we stopped and freehand sharpened. And I don't have good freehand sharpening gear. I have got this 4-sided block that I got from Harbor Freight for $7 some years ago. And I can get a good edge off of this thing, which goes to prove you don't need a bunch of expensive gear to get going sharpening. You don't need a bunch of expensive gear to start. You can do it with nearly anything that's got some sorry. You can do it with nearly anything that's got something that you can sharpen against, some kind of surface. This thing actually does really good for what it is, and I can get some sharp edges. Very nearly as sharp as the Precision Adjust, but, you don't need expensive stuff. And that $7 block sharpened the Rex 121 down to a 119. Little bit lower than the factory edge. Now, let's get the tester out. I will show you this thing so you understand what we're looking at with the tester. And, with the kind of edges we were putting on this, on D2 with a good heat treatment, we would have seen it go down to the 120s or lower. I've seen D2 go down to below 100 with the right edge geometry and the right grind on it. So, that's part of where I thought the 220s were a bit high and a bit disappointing for a factory edge, especially on something this expensive. But a 248. So like I said, you're testing an area this wide, and as you move back and forth, your numbers are going to change a little bit. But that was giving her the beans. And something that was real interesting was we did the sharpening, and that block ends at 600 grit. That block ends at 600 grit, so it was a 600 grit finish on to stropping it. I think that's part of what got it, but we'll talk about that in a minute here. We're going to go through some stuff that I learned. You know, that's the timeline of events. We're going to get into the stuff that I learned. There'll be a little bit of redundancy in some of this, but I want to cover this as thoroughly as I can. So one of the things that is really worth mentioning is the ergonomics. There is a lot happening back here where I am holding the knife like this to push through all the cardboard, do all my push cuts, because of how I'm sitting in the load table. You know, and I moved around a lot, but for the first time ever, I ended up wearing a glove. The ergonomics, they're okay. They're okay. It took 4.5 hours worth of non-stop push cuts through cardboard before it started getting too uncomfortable. I've had other knives where it wasn't a problem after that 4.5 hours, but with all this going on back here, the compression lock, all these gaps and everything, this took a toll, and I wound up wearing a glove because I was expecting to go for a lot of hours after that. So the ergos, they're a strong, decent. You know, it was just 4.5 hours that started to hurt. All the crap going on back here finally started to hurt too much. You know, and the flat grind on this thing was really nice to have, but that's where it started getting weird. You know, the edge provided a good bit of resistance on the cuts. That felt weird. It kind of felt both dull and sharp at the same time, which, you know, and again, this is where my lack of knowledge comes into play, and I'm speaking from a place of some ignorance, but it feels like the carbides in here, which there's like 30 some odd percent carbides in here. I think I heard 30%, I heard 38%, a few numbers got thrown around. But those carbides sticking out of the edge were part of what made it work like a micro-serrated edge. You know, and like it was definitely a weird experience. It felt weird the whole time. And I think this is where the numbers on that best tester were really skewed. You know, there are times where that best tester does not give you accurate information. I think this is one of them. You know, when I sharpened it down, it did the push cut on notebook paper, which the notebook paper I have is really hard to get a clean push cut on. After I hit it up to 3,000 grit and stropped it, it went through it like butter. It went through it like an edge down into the 120s. I think this is where it started screwing with the tester. You know, that's where you start seeing issues with that kind of tester. The best kept reading high numbers, and it was refined to 3,000 grit and stropped to death. It seemed like the carbide laden edge was cutting the wire in a weird way, and it did read dull. It was still passing through cardboard cleanly enough, but it was reading real high on that tester. We read areas up into the 600s, which on a normal steel is like a devastated edge, and it was still passing through the cardboard very cleanly. You know, and the wear on the primary cutting edge right in here wore a lot more evenly than a lot of steels I've used. You'd have one spot, that first point of contact with the cardboard, that would wear down to the 600s, and then the rest of it would be 450, 570. But, you know, this went a lot more evenly. You know, you'd find areas like 10 to 20 points of variance all the way across a much wider area, and you had to go way back to the heel to get a lower number. So that was really interesting. You know, and again, it was definitely a weird one. Now, with the reputation for being hard to sharpen, I was worried about sharpening it, but it went easier than expected. And I think that's because the bevel was nearly identical to the one that I wanted to put on it. So I wasn't hogging off a ton of material. It feels like it was already right at 17 degrees on the fat bevel. Like, you might be able to see how wide the bevel is here. Yeah, there you go. Which is pretty close to what I wanted on there. That being said, it took no time to get the edge put back on there, even after I had nuked it down to like over 1,000 cutting the glass. It did, however, feel like I was pushing the stones across ice. They were just sliding. They were just sliding across it, and they were just kind of putting the tiny burr on there, but it didn't feel like I was actually doing any sharpening. You know, we cut some more, and I was able to push it back into the better than factory edge range on that block. And I think what happened is the 600 grit finish, it was basically leaving a toothier finish, and with the teeth on it and the carbides, it was just kind of meshing together and making a more smooth edge than we had. Kind of hard to articulate. But the combination of the micro serrations from the 600 grit and the steel and the carbide sticking out, you just wound up with a much smoother edge on here than you would have at a higher grit that was exposing larger carbides. And I think that's part of why, I'm saying it felt like it was skating on there. I pulled the tiniest burr on it. I think the 3000 grit finish was leaving more carbides sticking out, and the 600 grit was burying the carbides in the steel a little bit deeper. It wasn't exposing them as much. And I stropped this a second time after freehand sharpening it, and it went down to a noticeably duller edge than when we had started. We had a 219, and then it went up into the 250s. So I believe that's what happened with the edge. It was a novel experience. And, again, with it being advertised at 70 plus or minus HRC from Spyderco, this feels like the steel is a lot softer than the carbides, and the carbides is where the HRC is coming from. It's just I was pulling back steel to expose more and more carbides, and yeah, it's just that rougher finish hid the carbides better. So, it was just a weird experience overall. More almost as much as or more so than the knife itself, I'm very, very grateful I got to experience this. At least I know how this steel performs and handles, although I don't know everything about why. I may know more than I think I do about why, but I could be wrong about a lot of it. It's just starting from a place of that much ignorance, and the information getting into the why isn't as available. It's really hard for me to guess why it did so weird, and my understanding is quite limited. I hope I understand everything correctly that I saw there, but, place of ignorance. So, and I don't like speaking from a place of ignorance, but I do like sharing what happened. So, it works almost opposite to about everything that I've learned so far. I'm learning this stuff as I go, which is a lot of the fun here, but this is kind of counterintuitive to most of what I've learned about how to handle knife steel. So, from where I'm sitting, the steel is basically a novelty, and this whole knife is mostly for flexing online. It's mostly for flexing in your Faceballs groups or on Reddit or Instagram, kind of posting, hey, I got this cool kind of expensive thing that not a lot of people have. Every time I've looked for it to buy one myself, because you guys did contribute to help buy one, it's been sold out. Our viewer that sent this, he got a hold of one apparently at a good price and had it sent my way. He went behind my back and went through a friend of mine that does have my address and had it sent that way instead of asking me and me saying I don't want to accept a gift that expensive. So, it got here. But I'm sure there's like a niche, some kind of niche use for it where you'd be using it a lot if you had it on you. But those are a really small niche compared to how a regular steel would treat you and be easier to sharpen. Like maybe cutting, like when I worked on a golf course, I had to cut a lot of nylon rope to maintain those edges on the cart path, the little fence things. And this would have been super useful there. I made an edge too fine on one of my knives, it wouldn't cut it. I had to get a rougher edge on the folding credit card knife to cut that, because the one that I sharpened myself wouldn't cut it. I didn't know that much about sharpening at that point. I didn't know I could just step it back to like a 600 grit finish and cut it the way I needed to. I just zipped it up to a high polish thinking, yeah, it'll just push cut right through it. Nope. I think this would be good there. But even then, I'd be scared of accidentally providing lateral force and breaking the blade or just chipping a huge chunk out. So it's like kind of a small niche where you'd actually get a lot of use out of it instead of just taking pictures for the internet. Now I will say, I used some wax on this thing to seal the blade up when I was done. I'll plug Mad Yocco's wax in a minute here, but that's just, man, that was a wild experience. It's just the whole stream was a novel experience, and I am so glad I got to do this. And again, some of the information I picked up here might be dead wrong, so take it with a grain of salt. And if you really know what's going on with this steel, please sound off in the comments, because I'd really love to learn more about what happened and why. But you guys know I love sharing with you what happened during Cardboard Slayer, and this video got real long in the tooth covering everything that I think I learned. So we're going to go ahead and cut over to our plug for our friends' products. Support your friends. They're not affiliate links. I don't make any money. They're just friends of the channel I want to support. So here you go. And as always, we are going to link up to Cutting Lacey EDC's Diamond Emulsion if you want to step your stropping game up, make it easier to sharpen your blades, and keep them sharp. Wonderful product. I use it myself on every single knife I sharpen now. And we are going to link up to Mad Yocco's wax. If you want to protect your blades that are prone to corrosion, if you want to darken up the color of your micarta, or take care of a million other things, he is going to be on Blade Binge with his wax. Alright, just supporting some friends of the channel and some small businesses. And all that being said, y'all have a nice day.